to be known as fulfillment theologians. And
okay,
sure,
so we need to stop here for a second, because a lot of this terminology it goes a little bit over my head, although I have a slight grasp of it. For a lot of people who are listening, they're not going to know what those three things mean. So supersessionist is what?
Well, it means that the church replaces Israel. And in the most sophisticated theological spectrum of today, you have Reformed of the, Luther and Calvin's teaching as it's been brought forth and continually perpetuated in American evangelical today by people like John Piper and, who would be a Reformed Baptist, and then the Presbyterians, and then the Dutch Reform. On the Anglican side, you would have a bishop, Tom Wright, N.T. Wright. His teaching is very, very popular as well as a type of supersessionism. But because of the Holocaust, they would not like to be termed that way. They like to be called fulfillment theologians. But it's still a supersessionism. And being an alliance minister, and this is why I became an alliance minister, I believe that there is a literal narrative to Scripture. And this would bring us back to premillennialism that has been corrupted, I think, in the United States because of the Darby movement out of the Brethren. Now, there were some brethren like George Mueller that did not hold to the audacity of Darby, and then what later became encodified in the Scofield Bible and became a very big part of 20th century evangelical thought. Schools like Dallas Seminary, Moody Bible Institute were all ones that gave this type of theology its, American evangelical scope. And it also was very influential.
So the premillennial viewpoint is what you're talking about,
correct,
right? And the premillennial viewpoint would be that
Jesus would come and sort it out, and there would be 100,000-year millennial reign. Correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So it is like an apocalyptic gospel. So coming through the Reformed years, after I was in the Reformed seminary, I then took a job with the Swedish Relief and Development Organization, and where my wife had connections in Brazil, and I worked in developing organizations working for children, vulnerable children in 15 countries. So I lived basically in an airplane. I had a lot of time to read. And then we lived a few years in Sweden, and I began attending an Anglican church. And I was never, even though through those years, I was actually ordained as a Presbyterian Church in America elder. It was a church in Orlando, Florida, and they still support us as missionaries, lovely people, friends from very special times who've always been with us. And I just enjoyed having this diversity. I mean, I grew up in, like maybe you, having the interdenominational connections, and always that was very special to me. But, knowing the nuances of our theological perspectives, I was always sensitive, because in missions, sometimes we put those aside. But nevertheless, now I was working in the gospel indeed. So much of evangelical was the word, Billy Graham crusades, preaching the gospel and word. And of course, I saw the holistic dimensions of the gospel and had a tremendous privilege to serve in those areas. But I also became theologically confronted with the abyss, the mystery. I mean, the Reformed have a way of putting God in a box. And it is, you get into these debates between free will and eternal security, the Calvinist Arminian debates, and there's many things there. Whereas in the Reformed tradition, it's not just all about salvation doctrine and substitutionary atonement type of theology, but there's also these epistemological dimensions. So I was very involved in also learning, how then shall we live? The old Francis Schaeffer, the Dutch schools, the Presbyterian schools, the old Princeton ways of common sense realism. I was looking at philosophy in a Calvinistic sense. And one of my professors there was Ronald Nash, and we had 3 schools of apologetics in Reformed Seminary. So it gave me a lot of things to kind of process. It took me 20 years to process it. And, but when I came to the Anglicans, I of course, reading a lot more of C.S. Lewis and just seeing, well, what's the difference with Anglicanism and the sacramentalism, and understanding the Reformation, understanding English Puritanism and the divisions within that, with Anglicanism, Congregationalism, Presbyterianism, and then there's John Bunyan, a little tinker Baptist from Bedford, who wrote the most powerful book besides the Bible in the last 400, 500 years, called Pilgrim's Progress, that kind of highlighted really that whole era. So beautiful things, beautiful theology. But when the 2000s came along, I started hearing about this emerging church and a lot of pushback against theologies.
Before we move to the emergent church thing, I want to back up